Gene Schroedel lays out the challenges to voting in Indian country. Check it out. Leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Welcome back. On the line with us is Gene Schroedel, the professor of public policy at Claremont Graduate University and author of a new book, Voting in Indian Country, The View from the Trenches. And Gene, welcome to the program. This is our Friday version of Monday's Indigenous People Day broadcast, as it were. And brilliant book. Could you start out by telling us about the legal status of Native peoples in the United States?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me. Native Americans, like any other person born within the United States, is a citizen of the United States. What is different is that the individuals who also belong to the 574 federally recognized tribes also have a native citizenship, and that gives them what could be considered tripartite citizenship, because even though most of us are not aware of it, the rest of us have dual citizenship. We have national citizenship and we have state citizenship, and each one has different rights. And it's interesting because that was the distinction that was used in the 19th century to keep women from voting, because the argument was the right to vote is a right of state citizenship, not national citizenship. So I'm not Native. I have dual citizenship. Tom, if I'm guessing you're not Native, you probably also have dual
Correct.
citizenship. But they have tripartite. But they have the right to vote, or should have the same right to vote as any other citizen of this country.
And yet, one of the stories that we're hearing in this year of massive Republican voter suppression all across the country, every opportunity they have, every way they can do it. And in fact, I remember this in 2016 as well, requiring, for example, ID that has specific street names and numbers, where in many Native communities there are no numbers on the streets. There's historically, obviously, the Native Americans are the only people who have been subject to a massive 4-century-long genocide. You could say African Americans have been the victim of terrible stuff, and I think in many ways it qualifies as a genocide, but it was the official policy of the United States government to kill Indians, Native Americans, for centuries. And to what extent is it still the policy of this government not to allow Native Americans to vote, or more broadly, to have political power?
Well, I think you have to distinguish again between national and state. I mean, there are state governments and political jurisdictions with large Native populations absolutely have adopted laws and policies and procedures that will disenfranchise Native people. They do denial, dilution, suppression. And what's interesting is these things occur with other minority populations. But when you're talking about Native Americans, there are always some unique twists. You were mentioning a moment ago voter identification, which would require people to have residential street addresses. I mean, in 2018, the Supreme Court, 3 weeks before the general election, allowed North Dakota to put that into practice. And they would have, in one foul swoop, disenfranchised roughly 5,000 people, many of whom had voted in the primary. Fortunately for those of us on the other side from those folks, people worked very, very hard in that very short period of time, to create addresses using GIS for people. But there are other things related to voter ID. So, for example, one of the stories that I got for my book involved an elderly Navajo woman, and she did not speak much English, and she had voted all of her life. And when voter ID came in, she was being disenfranchised because she had always used her thumbprint to vote, to prove who she was. So she collected materials, went in to the Department of Motor Vehicles, showed them her Native Navajo Nation documentation that she had been born here, but she didn't have a birth certificate. And the DMV near the closest to where she lived, said, blanket, we don't issue identification. This elderly woman went back to the tribe. They contacted a lawyer. The lawyer went with her to the DMV. The DMV still refused, the local one. The lawyer then went with this woman to the main DMV office in Flagstaff. And again, they were turning her down, and the lawyer had to threaten legal action. And this is a poor elderly woman, and it took a lawyer to force the state of Arizona to give her the identification that she needed to vote. I mean, it's just, excuse me, I just think it's crazy.
Yeah, I'm with you. We're talking with Jean Schroedel, who is the author of a new book, Voting in Indian Country, The View from the Trenches. Jean, you just told one remarkable story. You note in your book that history is essentially a living force in the present for Native people. Can you expand on that? And if you have an example to share with us, we have about 3 minutes here until we hit a hard break.
Okay. I mean, it's a sense that these battles are still being fought. When you travel in places such as Montana or South Dakota or even Arizona, that history is right there. In many places, the off-reservation white communities will have annual reenactments of Custer's heroic last stand. You will have Wounded Knee. Wounded Knee is in South Dakota. It's the site of both the protests in the 70s, the occupation, but also of an egregious massacre. And the attempts to keep Native people in South Dakota from voting are extraordinary. South Dakota, for example, sent out to all registered voters applications to vote by mail. But they required that people have those either notarized or officially witnessed. South Dakota also has a law that says if you vote and are living someplace other than where you lived, when you registered and is on file, you can be convicted of a felony, which allows you to be imprisoned for up to 5 years, knowing full well that large portions of people on reservation do not have stable living arrangements. At one point, I saw data showing that about 40% of people on the Pine Ridge Reservation didn't have a stable home address. They were moving from one place to another. Well, you could be living across the street from where you were when you registered, and you could be charged with a felony offense in the state of South Dakota. But have I got enough time to tell a
When did they pass that law, Jean?
Oh, gosh. That was quite a while ago. That's not a new one.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. They also are extremely active in purging the voting rolls. So between 2016 and 2020, the Rosebud Sioux Reservation is Todd County, as opposed to Oglala Lakota County, which is where most of Pine Ridge is. Between 2016 and 2020, 27% of the voters on the Pine Ridge Reservation were purged from the county's voting rolls. 27%.
That is mind-boggling. And so they would have to re-register in order to vote.
Right, but
these are just naked attempts to suppress the Indian vote, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's just incredible. Or we think about voting by mail, which everybody thinks very important in the middle of the pandemic. But if you take, for example, the Navajo Nation Reservation, which is mostly in Arizona but cuts over into Utah and New Mexico, it is larger than the state of West Virginia. There is no home mail, residential mail delivery on the reservation. West Virginia has 725 post offices. On the Navajo Nation, there are only 40 places, and not all are post offices, where you can get mail or send mail.
Remarkable. Jean Schroedel, Professor of Public Policy at Claremont Graduate University, the author of the new book, Voting in Indian Country, The View from the Trenches. Jean, thanks for dropping by and sharing this with us.